I just wanted peace. You know that kind of tranquility you find in an open field, with the sound of the wind rustling through the dry leaves, the crows squawking in the distance, and the smell of damp earth in the air? Yes, that's what I felt every time I looked out into my yard and saw the old Scarecrow standing there, stiffly, dressed in my father's clothes that had been gone for years. That doll was more than a piece of straw and rags. It was a memory. It was company. It was what reminded me that, even surrounded by walls and white picket fences, my soul still breathed rural freedom. But then she came. A new neighbor, with impeccably styled blonde hair, high heels for walking on grass, a light blue blazer that smelled of expensive perfume and arrogance. She had only moved in a few months ago, but already walked around the neighborhood as if she had founded it. I found out later that he had taken up a position on the HOA committee, and then things went off the rails. At first, it was just whispers. She would stare at my Scarecrow and whisper to the neighbors during her morning walks with her dog, a tiny animal with a studded collar that barked like it was at war. Then came the notes: visual obstruction of common aesthetics, unauthorized element in visible area, object incompatible with community standards, all printed out, stapled to letterheads with that ridiculous HOA stamp, as if it were a court of law. And me? I ignored it, because anyone who has a backyard with corn stalks, a small chicken coop, and a wooden bench under the oak tree knows that these things aren't just decoration, they are roots. And anyone who doesn't understand that should go and decorate their own balcony with plastic pots from Target. But she didn't give up. One day, I woke up to a smell of smoke. I thought it was just the neighbor's stove, which sometimes overdid the bacon, but it wasn't. When I went out the back door, there was the Scarecrow, or what was left of it, a black, smoking, melted heap on the grass. The smell of burnt fabric, charred straw, and, above all, disrespect. A smell that goes straight up your nose and into your chest. I went to the sidewalk, and she was standing there. She didn't even bother to pretend to be surprised. She just crossed her arms, gave a dismissive little smile, and said, without saying it, that it was a victory. And that's when I realized this woman didn't want a beautiful neighborhood. She wanted control. She wanted everyone to bow down to her idea of order. And the Scarecrow, standing still, silent, strange, was a reminder that not everyone followed her script. I went back inside without saying a word. I sat in the rocking chair in the kitchen, staring at nothing. I was angry, of course, but more than that, I needed an answer. Not direct revenge, nothing illegal, nothing that would put me on the same level as her, but something symbolic, something that would poke exactly where she was bothered. What did she hate most? The Scarecrow. What did she do? She burned it. So what would I do? I'd become the Scarecrow. The idea came to me out of the blue while I was washing my coffee mug in the late afternoon. I saw my reflection in the glass of the window, the sun beating down from behind, my body standing there with the cloth in my hand, and I imagined it. If I were dressed like him, still, silent, immobile, just watching. I bought the costume online, the hyper-realistic kind, faded straw hat, plaid shirt with patches, dirty jeans, leather gloves, and a mask that looked like it had come out of an 80s rural horror movie. All detailed. I spent more than I should have, but it was an investment in sanity. I waited for the weekend. On Sunday evening, with the neighborhood silent, I put on the costume and stood in the exact spot where the old Scarecrow had stood, my feet firmly on the ground, my arms slightly open, my head tilted forward. I stood there, immobile, for 2 hours. When the light on her balcony came on, I felt the snap. She opened the living room curtain, and I saw her silhouette hunched over. She stood still for a few seconds, then the curtain closed violently. I almost smiled through the mask. The next morning, I felt like an old crow perched on the roof of life itself, observing the chaos with a coffee in my hand and a slight smile on my lips. She hurried past with her starched puppy, her heels sinking into the damp grass, and avoided even looking in my direction. She pretended that nothing had happened, but I knew. I saw the fear dripping from her eyes like smudged eyeliner after a storm. And that, my friend, is priceless. Even HOA fines don't cover that kind of satisfaction. During the day, I pretended everything was normal. I took off my Scarecrow costume, stored everything carefully in the back closet, and went about my routine. But at night, it was a different story. I became someone else. I waited for her house to turn off the lights, for the neighborhood to sink into that silence that only small towns know, that heavy silence, where even the cricket is ashamed to make a sound. And then I'd leave. The costume was uncomfortable, I won't lie. The mask itched, the pants itched, and the hat kept slipping off in the early morning sun. But it was all worth it when I saw her window shutter shaking. It wasn't every day that she looked, but when she did, I knew. I felt the chill from across the street. That kind of ancestral fear that can't be explained, only felt. And that's when the magic happens. The fantasy wasn't just of a scarecrow. It was one of silent justice. She tried to keep her pose for the first few days. She gave an interview to the HOA newsletter, talking about community safety and suspicious people walking around at night. She even wrote a whole paragraph about disturbing elements with a grotesque appearance in other people's backyards. I barely disguised it. It was a message for me, or rather, to the Scarecrow. I read it while eating my morning porridge, and I laughed. I laughed like I hadn't in a long time, because I realized that, for the first time, the woman who was always imposing rules had lost control, and that made her more vulnerable than any HOA document. On the fourth night, I took things to another level. I planted 2 small posts with yellow reflectors next to where I was standing. Only I installed a lamp with a timer, which went on and off at irregular intervals. It looked like the Scarecrow was breathing. It blinked. It came to life. Cheap theatrics, perhaps, but the effect was undeniable. The neighbors began to comment. Some thought it was funny. Others found it bizarre. Some even asked if it was an art installation, the kind of thing that these cultish neighborhoods love to display at autumn festivals. But she freaked out. I received a letter from the HOA, signed by herself, claiming that installing structures with intermittent lighting in home-growing areas was a nighttime visual code infraction. I don't even know what that means. They made it up on the spot, I'm sure. She was desperate to stop what she didn't even know how it started. Only now, it was personal. I started varying the times. Sometimes I showed up early. Other times, very late. Some nights, I didn't go at all. And that made her even more upset. Because uncertainty is worse than fear. Fear lives in the maybe. And I was feeding that maybe with every silent step across the yard. The following Friday, an HOA security car showed up. A skinny security guard who looked like he'd been rejected by the city police and was now playing sheriff of a condominium. He kept circling my house, clipboard in hand and looking angry. I said good morning and offered him coffee. He didn't take it. He rushed out with a piece of paper. I bet he didn't even know what he was doing. But it went on record. War was declared. And while it was mobilizing small armies of bureaucracy, I just put on my straw clothes, climbed up on my sacred post, and faced the night as if I were the only witness to what sanity still remained in this sick neighborhood. I swear, I tried to maintain a boundary, a fine line between provocation and horror theater. But the woman seemed determined to cross every millimeter of common sense left on that street. When she couldn't stop me with tickets, letters, or ridiculous threats, she started knocking on doors trying to recruit neighbors for her anti-Scarecrow crusade. Can you believe it? In front of me, she feigned neutrality, but behind my back, she plotted like a spoiled child who wants the playground all to herself. Some neighbors laughed at the initiative. Others, the more influential ones, even tried to take it seriously. One afternoon, I came home from the market to find a petition stuck to my mailbox with pink tape. The title was something like, "For the Restoration of Nocturnal Decorum and Against Intimidating Practices in the Residential Environment." I didn't even have to open it to find out who had written it. The kind of phrase that only comes out of the head of someone who thinks the world is an extension of their own balcony. And the most absurd thing? There were only 3 signatures. Hers, that of her submissive husband, who looked like a decorative knick-knack in beige pants, and that of a lady who spends her days watching the cars out of the window with a pair of binoculars. An angry mob of 3 people and a chihuahua. But she didn't give up, and perhaps that was her biggest mistake, because the more she tried to erase my Scarecrow, the more I became it. From a nocturnal whim, it became a ritual. Every time I put on that outfit, it was like I was embodying something deeper. It wasn't about scaring, it was about resisting, about showing that sometimes the firm silence of a man standing in the yard speaks louder than 1,000 HOA meetings. I started making improvements. I added details to the costume. I sewed wooden buttons to the cuffs. I changed the filling in the belly to make it look fuller. I added a red scarf around my neck, just to give it more contrast when the light hit it. And each of these details seemed to set off a chain reaction in her. It was as if every little embellishment was a new personal offense, a reminder that she wasn't so much in charge. On a particularly cold night, I decided to stay longer. The sky was clear, the wind whipped through the branches of the trees, and all you could hear was the rustle of leaves on the ground. I stood there, breathing slowly behind my mask, like a forgotten shadow of the harvest. Around midnight, the light in her house came on again, but this time, she went out. She came to the edge of the sidewalk in a blue robe and flamingo print slippers. She carried a flashlight in one hand and her cell phone in the other, as if she were ready to record some imaginary crime. She stood there, staring. The flashlight was shaking, maybe from the cold, maybe from anger, maybe both. She looked at me for long seconds, trying, I imagine, to find some proof that I wasn't a doll, trying to see the human behind the act. Only I stood my ground. I didn't even breathe hard. The light danced on my mask, on the seams, on the shadows of the hat. And there, between 1 second and the next, I saw panic take over. She took a step back, then another, and ran back inside as if she'd seen her own childhood ghost. The door slammed, the lights went out, and once again, the neighborhood went back to sleep. The next day, the HOA distributed a new pamphlet, Guidelines on Nighttime Behavior and the Use of Visual Props in Outdoor Areas. The text was a bunch of pretentious words trying to say, "knock it off," without admitting that they were losing the battle. It was amusing to see how much they contorted themselves to feign authority when, deep down, they were terrified of a scarecrow with legs. And that's when I understood. They no longer knew how to act. The motionless figure standing there in the dark was making them confront something they couldn't control. And worse, something they themselves had created. Because if they hadn't destroyed the original Scarecrow, everything would have gone smoothly. But when you play with other people's symbols, you run the risk of awakening ghosts. In all honesty, I was starting to enjoy myself more than I should have. It got so absurd that the Scarecrow was no longer just a character. He was almost a neighborhood legend. Children started to comment on it, whispering to each other as they rode their bikes past my plot. There was even a little boy who, one Saturday morning, shouted from the sidewalk, "Are you the Scarecrow of the night?" I just smiled and nodded. His mother pulled the boy by the arm, embarrassed, as if she had caught him talking to a spirit from beyond. But the boy laughed. He understood. Children always understand before adults that sometimes monsters are real, but they're not where you think they are. The woman, on the other hand, sank into a state of progressive paranoia. She started installing cameras around the house, bought 2 industrial spotlights that were on all night, and put motion sensors pointed directly at my yard. In practice, all this only made the Scarecrow's silhouette stand out more when I was standing there. Every flash of light made the shadows more vivid, more theatrical. What was supposed to be a defense became a stage. And me, well, I became the protagonist. On one of the most intense nights, she went berserk. She came screaming out of the gate, dressed in an HOA t-shirt 2 sizes too small, pointing to some paper that looked more like a mattress store pamphlet than an official notice. It said it was a new committee resolution banning elements of continuous visual intimidation after 8 p.m. I didn't even move, not even when she threw the paper in my direction as if it were a legal bomb about to explode in the form of a fine. I just stood there, standing up, arms open, wind whipping through my sleeves, and that eternal pose of silence that she hated so much. The neighborhood watched everything from their windows. A few lights on, curtains slightly drawn, curious eyes hidden behind foggy glass. It was like a play without a script, but with captive spectators. No one dared interfere. Not for her, not for me, because, in a way, everyone there was watching the struggle between 2 worlds, that of manufactured order, of meetings with donuts and rules printed in Comic Sans, and that of mute resistance, made with straw, sewing, and a pinch of madness. After that episode, she disappeared for a few days. Some said she had gone to visit relatives. Others swear she had a nervous breakdown and needed to rest. I don't know. I didn't even try to find out. I just kept the Scarecrow alive, in place, at the right time. Even when the cold started to bite, I didn't fail. It was more than pride. It was a mission, and I carried it out with zeal. A while later, a letter arrived, official, but not from the HOA. It was from the city administration. It informed me that, after analyzing the conduct of the neighborhood association and recent records of abuse of power, the city had decided to temporarily suspend the HOA committee for restructuring. Restructuring. A beautiful word. Full of promises, fresh starts, and layoffs. No one named names, but everyone knew why. The woman who burned my Scarecrow, who invoked 1,000 non-existent rules, who turned her own obsession into a public crusade, was now being replaced by a provisional board. Among the names suggested for this new formation, mine. I laughed so hard when I read that I almost fell off my chair. Of course, I turned it down. I'm not the type who likes meetings with weak coffee and talk of community values, but I agreed to attend the first meeting as a guest. And yes, I went dressed up. No mask, of course, but with the hat, the plaid shirt, and the gloves. Just to make it clear that sometimes the Scarecrow also sits at the table. She didn't even show up. They say she put her house up for sale soon after. To this day, nobody knows where she went. Some say she moved to a gated community with even stricter rules. Others say she's on some spiritual retreat in the desert. Honestly, whatever. What matters is that here, in my backyard, the Scarecrow is back. The original. Rebuilt. Standing firm. And every night, before I go to sleep, I look at it through the window and give thanks. Because it was because of that pile of straw and fabric that I regained not only my space, but also my will to fight, to resist the absurd, to turn persecution into a spectacle. In the end, she thought she could burn my Scarecrow, and she ended up burning her own reputation. Satisfied? More than that. I'm at peace. Because sometimes, the best way to win is just to stand still and let fear do the rest. And if you liked this video, don't forget to leave your opinion in the comments and your like.